I never imagined I'd attend my own memorial service. Not because I wanted to, not because it was some strange family tradition. I went because my own son had convinced everyone I was already dead. He printed my photograph on a memorial program. He accepted condolences from people who had known me for decades. He stood in front of a room full of grieving friends and relatives, pretending to mourn a mother who was still very much alive. And while they cried for me, he was only waiting for the keys to my house. If you had asked anyone in our town what kind of man my son Ryan was, most of them would have described him as charming, helpful, funny. The kind of person who never forgot birthdays and always smiled at the neighbors. They didn't know what I knew. They didn't see the version of Ryan that only appeared when money entered the conversation. I wasn't always suspicious of him. Actually, I spent most of my life believing I'd raised a good man. I'm Margaret Ellis. I'm 67 years old, a retired elementary school teacher. And until a few months ago, I believed the greatest blessing in my life was having a son. Looking back now, I realize love has a dangerous habit of hiding the truth from parents, especially when that truth wears your child's face. My husband David passed away 11 years ago after a long battle with cancer. The house we shared together became the only place where I still felt close to him. Every room carried a memory. The kitchen where we danced while dinner burned on the stove. The porch where we drank coffee every Sunday morning. The old oak tree he planted the week Ryan was born. People often asked why I never sold the house. They assumed it was too large for one woman. Maybe they were right. But homes aren't measured by square footage. They're measured by the lives that happened inside them. And this house held an entire lifetime. It wasn't just property. It was the last place where my husband still felt real. Ryan knew that better than anyone, which is why I never imagined he'd someday see it as nothing more than a paycheck. For years, he dropped little comments that sounded harmless. You know, Mom, houses like yours are worth a fortune now. You'd have a much easier life in a retirement community. That neighborhood is getting expensive. Each sentence sounded like concern. At least, that's how I chose to hear it. A mother becomes very good at translating warning signs into affection. I ignored every uncomfortable feeling because admitting the truth would have meant admitting something much worse. That maybe my son wasn't worried about my future. Maybe he was waiting for it. The first time that thought crossed my mind, I pushed it away so quickly I almost felt guilty. What kind of mother thinks something like that? The answer, I would eventually learn, is the kind of mother whose instincts were trying to save her. A few months before everything fell apart, I came down with a severe case of pneumonia. At first, I thought it was just another stubborn winter cold. Then came the fever, the coughing, the dizziness. Within days, I was too weak to stand without help. My doctor insisted I be admitted to the hospital immediately. I argued. Of course I argued. Teachers are stubborn by nature. Widows can be even worse. But eventually, I gave in. When Ryan arrived at the hospital, he looked genuinely worried. He held my hand. He told the nurses not to let me stress about anything. He kissed my forehead before leaving and smiled. "Don't worry, Mom," he whispered. "I'll take care of everything while you're gone." At the time, those were the most comforting words I could have heard. I had no idea they would become the most terrifying promise anyone had ever made to me. Because while I was fighting to breathe, my son had already started planning a future where I never would again. The first few days in the hospital passed in a blur of oxygen masks, IV lines, and nurses checking my vital signs every few hours. Pneumonia has a strange way of making time disappear. Some mornings I woke up convinced I'd only been asleep for a few minutes. Other times, I couldn't tell if it was Tuesday or Friday. The medication left me exhausted. Simple conversations felt like running a marathon. That was when Ryan stepped in. At least, that's what everyone believed. He arrived every afternoon carrying fresh flowers or my favorite magazines. He laughed with the nurses. He thanked the doctors. He told anyone who would listen that his mother had always taken care of everyone else, and now it was his turn to take care of her. I remember watching him from my hospital bed and thinking David would have been proud of the man our son had become. It's amazing how convincing kindness can look when someone has an audience. One afternoon, Ryan sat beside my bed, with a small folder tucked under his arm. "I've been handling your mail," he said casually. "Mostly bills and junk. Nothing important." I smiled. "Thank you." He shrugged as if it were no trouble at all. I also spoke with the insurance company. They needed to verify a few things. "You're a lifesaver," I told him. He reached over and squeezed my hand. That's what family does. At the time, those words warmed my heart. Today, they make my stomach turn. The truth was, I never asked him to manage my finances. I never asked him to collect my mail. I never asked him to speak to anyone on my behalf. He simply started doing it. And because I trusted him completely, I never questioned it. A week later, my fever finally broke. The doctors were pleased with my progress, but they didn't want to send me home just yet. My lungs were still weak, and they recommended I spend another couple of weeks at a rehabilitation center where I could regain my strength before returning home. I wasn't thrilled about the idea. I missed my own bed. I missed my garden. I even missed the old grandfather clock that chimed every hour. Ryan immediately agreed with the doctors. "I think that's the safest option," he said, before I had a chance to respond. "You've earned a little extra care." Looking back, I should have noticed how quickly he answered, almost as if he'd been hoping they'd suggest it. The rehabilitation center was quiet, peaceful. Most of the patients were older than I was. The days settled into a predictable routine of breathing exercises, physical therapy, and short walks down long hallways. My biggest frustration wasn't the therapy. It was the silence. For some reason, almost no one called. At first, I assumed people simply didn't know where I was. Then I started wondering if maybe everyone was just busy. Ryan always had an explanation. Aunt Linda is visiting her daughter. The neighbors have been traveling. Everyone keeps asking about you, Mom. I tell them you're getting stronger every day. His answers sounded reasonable. So I believed them. One morning, I asked for my cell phone. "I'd like to call Carol," I said, thinking about my closest friend of nearly 30 years. Ryan hesitated. Then he gave me an apologetic smile. "I'm afraid it stopped working." "What do you mean?" "It wouldn't turn on. I took it to be repaired." "Oh. I'll have it back soon." It seemed like such a small inconvenience. After all, I wasn't exactly scrolling through social media every day. I accepted his explanation without another question. That decision still haunts me. Because my phone had never been broken. It had never gone in for repairs. Ryan had simply taken it. Without my phone? Without my mail? Without visitors? My world became exactly as small as he needed it to be. I had no idea that outside those rehabilitation walls, people had already started asking why they hadn't heard from me. Some assumed I needed privacy. Others worried I was getting worse. Every concern found its way to Ryan, and Ryan always had an answer ready. Mom's resting. She's too tired for visitors. The doctors don't recommend too much excitement. No one questioned him. Why would they? He was the devoted son spending every day at his mother's side. At least, that was the role he wanted everyone to believe. Then, one afternoon, I overheard two nurses talking quietly near the hallway outside my room. I thought her family would visit more often, one of them whispered. The son said she doesn't really want company, the other replied. I frowned. That wasn't true. I had never said any such thing. When Ryan arrived later that evening, I mentioned it. The nurses seemed to think I don't want visitors. For the first time since I'd become sick, his smile faltered, only for a second. Then it returned. I probably misunderstood what they were asking, he said, with a soft laugh. I'll clear it up tomorrow. I nodded. The explanation sounded perfectly reasonable. But after he left, I couldn't fall asleep. It wasn't anything he had said. It was the way he had said it. For the first time in my life, something about my own son's smile didn't feel familiar. It felt practiced. And although I couldn't explain why, sleep didn't come easily that night. No matter how many times I closed my eyes, I kept replaying Ryan's expression in my mind. It wasn't fear. It wasn't guilt. It was something colder. The look of someone who had rehearsed an answer long before the question was ever asked. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, pneumonia leaves you exhausted. Medication can make your thoughts wander. Maybe I was simply overthinking. By morning, I had convinced myself to let it go. The rehabilitation center settled into its usual rhythm. Breakfast at 7, breathing exercises at 9, physical therapy before lunch. Everything was predictable. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. The silence bothered me more with each passing day. Not a single phone call. Not one familiar face. No flowers from my church friends. No visits from my former coworkers. It wasn't like them. I had spent 38 years teaching in the same school district. I had lived in the same neighborhood for nearly 4 decades. People didn't simply disappear from my life overnight. Yet, somehow, everyone had. Just after lunch, there was a soft knock on my door. One of the nurses smiled politely. "Margaret, you have a visitor." I looked up in surprise. A visitor? Yes. She says her name is Emily. Relief washed over me. Emily Carter had lived next door for 6 years. She was in her early 30s, worked as a nurse at another hospital across town, and had become the closest thing I had to family outside of Ryan. She checked on me after every snowstorm, watered my flowers whenever I traveled. She even brought homemade cinnamon rolls every Christmas morning, because, as she liked to say, no one should eat breakfast alone on Christmas. A moment later, Emily stepped into the room. The second she saw me, she froze. Her hand slipped from the doorknob. For several long seconds, she simply stared. Her face had completely lost its color. I laughed softly. Emily? She didn't answer. Instead, she whispered something I could barely hear. Oh my God. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. Emily, are you all right? She blinked several times before slowly walking toward my bed. She stopped again. I'm sorry. She looked at me as though she were trying to convince herself I was real. You look like you've seen a ghost, I joked. Instead of laughing, she looked like she might cry. Finally, she sat down beside me. Her hands were shaking. Margaret, I don't understand what's happening. Neither did I. What do you mean? She took a slow breath. I've been trying to see you for over a week. I went to your house twice. Ryan answered the door. I frowned. He said the doctors weren't allowing visitors. Emily nodded. Then I asked which hospital you were in. He told me you'd been moved somewhere private. That wasn't true. No one had asked me whether I wanted privacy. No one had even mentioned visitors. I thought it seemed odd, Emily continued. But he sounded so convincing. So I believed him. She hesitated before opening her handbag. I almost didn't come today. She pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. My friend works at the rehabilitation center. When she mentioned your name this morning, I thought she'd made some kind of mistake. She handed me the envelope. I think you should see this. I carefully opened it. Inside was a beautifully printed invitation. White lilies decorated the edges. The paper was expensive. Elegant. My eyes moved to the center of the page. Then everything inside me went still. A celebration of the life of Margaret Ellis. My photograph smiled back at me. The same picture taken at my retirement party years ago. Beneath it, my full name, my date of birth, and underneath that, one sentence. Please join us as we honor her beautiful life and loving memory. The invitation slipped slightly in my trembling hands. What? I whispered. What is this? Emily's eyes filled with tears. They've been mailing these all over town. I looked back at the card. At the bottom, the date. Tomorrow, 3:00 in the afternoon, at my church. I stared at it for what felt like forever. Tomorrow. Not next month. Not someday. Tomorrow. this has to be some kind of mistake, I said. Emily slowly shook her head. I don't think it is. She reached into her bag again. This time she unfolded a newspaper. There, tucked neatly into the community announcement section, was my obituary. It spoke about my kindness, my years as a teacher, my late husband, even my favorite charity. It was beautifully written, painfully accurate, except for one detail. I was still alive. At the bottom appeared the words, survived by his devoted son, Ryan Ellis. I felt the room begin to spin. No, I whispered. No. Emily leaned forward. Margaret, everyone thinks you passed away 2 days ago. I couldn't breathe. Not because of my lungs, because somewhere beyond those walls, people were mourning me. My church believed I was gone. My neighbors believed I was gone. Former students, friends, everyone. And every one of them had heard the same story, that I had requested privacy during my final days, that I didn't want visitors, that Ryan had been faithfully by my side until the very end. Every missing phone call, every empty hallway, every excuse Ryan had given me
perfect sense. He hadn't been protecting my peace. He had been protecting his lie. I looked down at the invitation once more. My own memorial service. Already planned. Already organized. Flowers ordered. Food arranged. Guests invited. The pastor scheduled to speak. Someone had spent weeks preparing a farewell for a woman who had never left. Emily reached across the bed and gently squeezed my hand. What are you going to do? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I kept staring at the invitation, my photograph, my name, my goodbye. Then, for the first time since this nightmare began, something inside me changed. The fear disappeared. In its place came something much quieter, much stronger. Resolve. I folded the invitation carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Then, I looked directly at Emily. They're expecting a memorial tomorrow. She nodded silently. I stood up as straight as my aching body would allow. Then they shouldn't be disappointed. Emily frowned. What do you mean? I met her eyes. A calmness settled over me that I hadn't felt in days. If my son wants the world to believe I'm dead, then tomorrow, I paused. I'm going to attend my own memorial service. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The invitation rested quietly in my lap. My own photograph smiled back at me. It was strange. Looking at that picture felt like looking at someone else. Someone whose life had already ended. Someone the world had already begun to forget. Emily finally broke the silence. Margaret, shouldn't we call the police? It was the obvious question.
the responsible question. Maybe even the smartest one. But something inside me wasn't ready. Not yet.
If Ryan had gone to the trouble of publishing an obituary, booking a church, mailing invitations, convincing an entire community that I was gone, then this wasn't a desperate lie. It was a carefully constructed plan. And plans always have a purpose. I need to know what he's really after, I said quietly. Emily looked confused. Isn't that obvious? I slowly shook my head. No. If all he wanted was sympathy, he wouldn't have gone this far. I looked down at the invitation again. This is leading to something. Emily remained silent. I could see she was thinking through every detail. Then she asked the question neither of us wanted to say out loud. Has anything gone missing from your house? I frowned. I don't know. I haven't been home. My checkbook is there, my financial records, the deed to the house, my husband's documents. Every word made my stomach tighten. The house. Without realizing it, my eyes drifted toward the window. David and I had spent 39 years paying for that home. Every extra shift, every canceled vacation, every dollar carefully saved. It wasn't just where we lived. It was everything we had built together. Ryan knew that. He also knew one more thing. The mortgage had been paid off years ago. There were no loans, no debts. No one else owned a single inch of that property. Leaned closer. Emily. Margaret, has Ryan ever asked about the house? I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because the answer suddenly seemed so obvious. For years. The memories came flooding back. Mom, this neighborhood is becoming expensive. That house is worth a fortune now. You know, you'd be happier somewhere smaller. At the time, I'd heard concern. Now, all I could hear was calculation. Emily quietly reached for her phone. I want to check something. What? The county property records. I watched as she searched through the public database. Neither of us expected to find anything. Then, her expression changed. What is it? I asked. She turned the screen toward me. There hasn't been a transfer. Relief is. A breath escaped my chest. For one brief moment. Then Emily added, but my heart sank again. Someone requested copies of the property's recorded documents 3 days ago? I stared at the screen. What does that mean? It doesn't transfer ownership, but people usually request those copies when they're preparing paperwork. Preparing paperwork. The words echoed inside my head. Ryan wasn't celebrating my memory. He was preparing for something. Something that hadn't happened. Yet. Emily looked at the invitation again. The memorial is tomorrow afternoon. I nodded. What happens afterward?
Neither of us answered. We didn't have to. The answer was beginning to reveal itself. If the entire town believed I was dead, who would question Ryan cleaning out my house? Who would question movers carrying away furniture? Who would question a realtor placing a sign in the front yard? No one. Because grieving sons are rarely questioned. They're comforted, trusted, left alone. Exactly what Ryan needed.
A knock at the door interrupted our thoughts. Both of us turned. One of the rehabilitation nurses stepped inside. "Mrs. Ellis? Your son just called." Emily and I exchanged a quick glance. I forced a smile. "What did he say?" The nurse checked the message she'd written down. "He said he won't be able to visit tomorrow. He'll be attending to family arrangements." The room fell silent. Family arrangements. I knew exactly what those arrangements were. My own memorial service. I thanked the nurse, and she quietly left. The moment the door closed, Emily let out a slow breath. "He really thinks you're going to stay here." I nodded. That's exactly what he thinks. For the first time in days, I wasn't frightened anymore. I was angry. Not because Ryan wanted my house. Houses can be rebuilt. Money can be earned again. What shattered me was something far more painful. My own son hadn't waited for me to die. He had simply decided it would be more convenient if everyone believed I already had. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was just after 4 in the afternoon. Less than 24 hours remained. Emily squeezed my hand. If we're really doing this, we need a plan. I nodded slowly. No surprises. No dramatic confrontation. I want everyone to hear exactly what Ryan has to say about me before they see me walk through those church doors. Emily stared at me for a second. Then, despite everything that had happened, a faint smile appeared on her face. "I have a feeling your son is about to have the worst day of his life." I looked down at the memorial invitation one final time. Tomorrow at 3 o'clock. The church will be filled with flowers. Friends. Neighbors. Former students. People ready to say goodbye. None of them knew the guest of honor was planning to arrive. The next morning arrived far too quickly. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that invitation, my photograph, my obituary, my goodbye. By 8 o'clock, I was already dressed. Not in black, not in bright colors, just a simple navy blue dress with a long gray coat. The same coat David had bought me on our 25th wedding anniversary.
it suddenly felt appropriate. Not because I was mourning, but because I was about to watch the people I loved mourn me. Emily arrived just after noon. She carried a small overnight bag. "You ready?" she asked gently. I looked at myself in the mirror. For the first time in weeks, I hardly recognized the woman staring back. She looked tired, older. Her face was thinner from the illness, but her eyes looked stronger than they had in years. As ready as I'll ever be. Emily had thought of everything. She brought a wide-brimmed hat, a pair of simple reading glasses with thick frames. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make me invisible. Just enough that people wouldn't immediately recognize me from across a crowded room. The rehabilitation staff believed Emily was taking me to a follow-up medical appointment. No one questioned it. Within minutes, we were sitting quietly inside her car. Neither of us spoke much during the drive. The closer we came to my church, the heavier the silence became. I had attended hundreds of services there. Christmas celebrations, weddings, baptisms, my husband's funeral. Never. Had I imagined attending my own funeral? As we turned onto Maple Street, traffic became unusually heavy. Cars lined both sides of the road. The church parking lot was almost completely full. Emily parked half a block away. "We can still leave," she said softly. I looked toward the church entrance. People were already gathering outside. Neighbors, old friends, families I hadn't seen in years. Some carried flowers. Others carried photographs. Many wore black. I slowly shook my head. No. If I leave now, my son wins. We walked the remaining distance in silence. Each step felt strangely unreal. The closer we came, the more familiar faces I recognized. Mrs. Peterson from church, the Wilson family, 3 former students, grown adults now, standing near the entrance with their own children. One woman wiped tears from her eyes before stepping inside. Another quietly hugged someone in the parking lot. Every single one of them believed they had come to say goodbye. Not one of them knew. The woman they were grieving was standing less than 20 feet away. Emily gently touched my arm. "You okay?" I swallowed. I don't know. That was the truth. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't scared. Mostly, I was heartbroken. Not because strangers believed the lie. Because they had believed it without ever getting the chance to tell me goodbye. Ryan had stolen something much bigger than my house. He had stolen my final moments with the people who cared about me. We waited until the church bells finished ringing before walking inside. The sanctuary smelled exactly as it always had. Fresh flowers, old wood, burning candles. Soft organ music drifted through the room. Rows of white lilies surrounded the front platform. At the center stood a large framed photograph. Mine. the same retirement picture from the invitation. Someone had even placed David's old military flag beside it. I felt my knees weaken. Emily quietly steadied me before anyone noticed. "You don't have to keep going." "Yes," I whispered. "I do." Together, we slipped into the very last pew. Almost no one looked our way. Everyone's attention remained fixed on the front of the church. Within a few minutes, nearly every seat was occupied. The pastor stepped onto the stage. He adjusted the microphone and looked across the congregation. "Thank you all for coming today." His voice echoed gently through the sanctuary. "We gather to celebrate the life of a woman whose kindness touched countless lives." I closed my eyes. The pastor wasn't lying. He genuinely believed I was gone. Ryan had fooled him too. The pastor continued speaking about my years as a teacher, my volunteer work, my love for my late husband. Many people quietly wiped away tears. Then he said something that broke my heart. Margaret often told me that the greatest blessing God ever gave her was her son. I lowered my head, because that part was true. I had said those exact words many times. Emily reached over and silently took my hand. Neither of us noticed Ryan walking toward the podium until the room erupted into gentle applause. I looked up. There he was, perfectly dressed in a black suit, his tie neatly pressed, his expression carefully composed. He paused for a moment before speaking, as if holding back tears, as if grief had stolen his voice. The performance had begun. He looked around the sanctuary, took a slow breath, then smiled sadly. My mother was the strongest person I've ever known. The room fell completely silent, and for the first time since discovering the truth, I looked at my own son, not as the little boy I had raised, but as a stranger wearing his face. My mother was the strongest person I've ever known. Ryan lowered his eyes, as though the memories were almost too painful to carry. A few people in the front rows quietly dabbed at their eyes. "I know many of you saw her as a teacher." He managed a weak smile. "I was lucky enough to call her Mom." A soft murmur spread through the sanctuary. He paused, just long enough to make his voice a tremble. "When my father passed away, I honestly didn't think either of us would survive that kind of loss." I felt Emily's hand tighten around mine. Every word he spoke contained just enough truth to make the lies believable. He talked about my years volunteering at the church food pantry. He mentioned the neighborhood Christmas dinners I used to host. He remembered how I never forgot anyone's birthday. People smiled through their tears. Several even nodded. Then he looked toward my framed photograph. I kept telling Mom she needed to slow down. A few gentle laughs echoed through the room. She always said she'd rest someday. His voice cracked. I guess God decided someday had finally come. Someone in the front row began crying openly. Ryan stopped speaking. He reached into his pocket, removed a folded handkerchief, and slowly wiped his eyes. The performance was flawless. If I hadn't known the truth, I might have believed him myself. He looked toward the pastor before continuing. My mother only wanted one thing. She wanted this family to stay together. She hated conflict. She believed forgiveness mattered more than money. The words hit me harder than I expected. Because those weren't just convenient lies. They were things I had actually taught him. Things I had repeated throughout his childhood. Lessons I thought he had forgotten. Instead, he had simply learned how to use them against me. Ryan took a slow breath. Before she passed, Mom and I had several long conversations. I stared at him. No, we hadn't. The last meaningful conversation we'd shared was in my hospital room. Everything after that had been carefully controlled. He continued without hesitation. She told me she didn't want anyone fighting over what she'd leave behind. Several people nodded sympathetically. So I'll do everything I can to honor her wishes. There it was. Not the full truth, just the first step toward it. He wasn't asking for my house. Not yet. He was planting the idea, preparing everyone to believe that whatever happened after today was exactly what I wanted. Emily leaned closer and whispered, "He's setting the stage." I barely nodded. Yes. He wants witnesses. The sanctuary. I know the next few weeks will be difficult. There will be paperwork. There will be difficult decisions. But I promise you, I'll take care of everything. Everything. That single word echoed inside my mind. The house. The bank accounts. David's belongings. The photographs. Our memories. Everything. Ryan lowered his head one final time. I only hope I can make my mother proud. The sanctuary filled with quiet applause. I couldn't bring myself to clap. Neither could Emily. The pastor returned to the podium. Thank you, Ryan. I know how difficult that must have been. Ryan nodded humbly before taking his seat in the front row beside Olivia. She slipped her hand into his. For just a second, neither of them looked sad. They looked relieved, like the hardest part was over. The pastor opened his Bible. He spoke about grief, about faith, about the hope of seeing loved ones again. Normally, I would have found comfort in those words. Today, they felt unbearably heavy. because everyone listening believed they were comforting a son who had lost his mother, not a son who had buried her while she was still alive. After the reading, the pastor closed the Bible and looked across the congregation. If anyone else would like to share a memory of Margaret, you're welcome to come forward. For a moment, no one moved. Then an elderly woman from my church slowly stood. It was Helen Brooks. We had served together in the food pantry for nearly 15 years. She smiled through her tears. I'll never forget the winter my husband broke his hip. She laughed softly. I didn't even know Margaret knew. But every evening, she left a hot meal on my porch. She never knocked. She never wanted credit. She simply wanted to help. Helen wiped away a tear. The world needs more people like Margaret. She returned to her seat as the congregation applauded quietly. Next came one of my former students. He was nearly 40 now. I wasn't an easy kid. A few people chuckled. I gave Mrs. Ellis every reason to give up on me. But she didn't. He smiled toward my photograph. Because of her, I became a teacher. My throat tightened. I remembered him. He had struggled to read until 6th grade. Watching him speak with such confidence should have filled me with pride. Instead, it filled me with grief. These people had been robbed of a proper goodbye, not by fate, by my own son. One after another, people walked to the microphone. Each story revealed another piece of the life I had lived, the lives I had touched, the friendships I had cherished, the kindness they remembered. I listened in silence, sometimes smiling, sometimes crying. Every memory reminded me of something Ryan could never steal. Not the house, not the furniture, not the money. A life measured by love leaves behind something far more valuable than property. Finally, the room grew quiet again. The pastor stepped forward. He smiled gently. Thank you. I believe Margaret would have been deeply touched by everything we've heard today. He glanced around the sanctuary one last time. If there's anyone else, this is your opportunity. Silence. No one stood. The pastor gave a small nod and reached for the closing prayer. I looked at Emily. She looked back at me. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. This was the moment. The moment my son believed his lie had become permanent. The moment every person in that church accepted that Margaret Ellis was gone forever. I slowly removed my gloves. My fingers trembled. Not from fear, from everything this moment meant. Emily whispered, "Are you sure?" I looked toward the front of the photograph. At the flowers. At my son sitting in the front pew. Then I quietly stood. The wooden pew creaked beneath me. A few people in the back turned their heads. No one recognized me. Not yet. I took one slow step into the aisle. Then Another. The church was so quiet. The sound of my shoes against the wooden floor seemed impossibly loud. With every step toward the front, more people began to look. Confused expressions appeared across the room. A woman frowned. An older man leaned forward. Ryan remained seated. He hadn't noticed me. His attention was fixed on the pastor. I kept walking, slowly, deliberately, until I was only a few feet from the podium. The pastor looked at me with a kind smile. "Ma'am, would you like to share a memory?" I met his eyes. Then, without saying a single word, I reached up, removed my hat, slipped off my glasses, and looked directly at my son. For what felt like an eternity, no one moved. The pastor's gentle smile slowly faded. His eyes searched my face. Confusion turned into disbelief. The Bible slipped slightly in his hands. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Do I know you?" I looked at him with a sadness I couldn't put into words. "Yes, Pastor." My voice was calm. "You've known me for nearly 20 years. The sanctuary fell completely silent. Several people frowned. The pastor blinked. Then his eyes widened. His lips parted, but no words came. I turned away from him. My eyes found Ryan. He had finally looked up. At first, he simply stared. His face emptied of all expression, like his mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. Olivia followed his gaze. The color drained from her face instantly. She grabbed Ryan's arm so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Ryan?" she whispered. "What is that?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. For the first time that afternoon, his perfectly rehearsed mask cracked. I took another slow step forward. "Hello, Ryan." My voice echoed through the sanctuary. Someone gasped loudly. Another person whispered, "That's Margaret." No, it can't be. Within seconds, the entire church erupted into shocked murmurs. People stood from their seats. Several turned completely around just to get a better look at me. Helen Brooks covered her mouth with both hands. One of my former students actually stumbled backward into a pew. The pastor looked from me to the photograph surrounded by white lilies, and then back to me again. "I don't understand," he whispered. Neither did anyone else. Except because Ryan knew exactly why I was standing there. His hands began to shake. He slowly rose from his seat. "Mom," the word barely escaped his mouth. I stopped a few feet away from him. "No, you don't get to call me that right now." The room became so quiet that I could hear someone crying near the back of the church. Ryan swallowed hard. This isn't... He looked around desperately, searching for an explanation that... "Mom," I can explain. I nodded once. I'm sure you can. You've been explaining everything for weeks. A ripple of uneasy laughter passed through the congregation. Not because anything was funny, because people suddenly realized they had been lied to. Ryan stepped toward me. I thought... You thought what? My voice remained steady. You thought I wouldn't walk through that door? He froze. Olivia slowly backed away from him. For the first time since I'd entered the church, she let go of his hand. The pastor finally found his voice. Ryan. He looked utterly devastated. You told me your mother passed away. Ryan stared at the floor. You asked me to lead this memorial. You looked me in the eye. You prayed with me. Every sentence from the pastor sounded heavier than the last. You never once told me it wasn't true. Ryan opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Then a man stood from the third row. It was Daniel Harper, a local real estate broker. I'd known Daniel for years. He looked confused. Ryan, I thought we were meeting tomorrow morning. Ryan's head snapped toward him. Daniel frowned. You said the memorial would be over by then. You told me the house would finally be ready to list. An audible gasp spread across the sanctuary. Every eye turned back toward Ryan. Daniel looked around, suddenly realizing something was terribly wrong. I'm sorry. I don't understand. I looked directly at Daniel. What house? He answered without hesitation. Yours. Ryan quickly interrupted. It wasn't like that. Daniel frowned again. You told me your mother had passed away. You said you were the executor and wanted to sell the property immediately. I even prepared the preliminary listing agreement. The room fell silent again. Ryan's breathing became uneven. I looked him straight in the eyes. Executor? My estate hasn't even been opened. I never signed a will naming you executor. His shoulders dropped. For the first time, he looked exactly like what he was. A frightened man trapped inside his own lies. Daniel slowly reached into the leather folder he'd been carrying. I also brought these. He removed several documents. I was going to review everything with you tomorrow. He stopped speaking as he looked through the paperwork. His forehead wrinkled. Ryan, where is the certified death certificate? Ryan said nothing. Daniel flipped another page. And where is the probate authorization? Still nothing. He looked up. I asked you twice to bring both documents. You kept saying your attorney was handling them. The realization hit Daniel like a freight train. There isn't an attorney. There isn't a death certificate. He slowly closed the folder. Oh my God. You were trying to sell a house that you don't legally own. The church exploded with voices. People began talking over one another. Some looked furious. Others looked completely stunned. The pastor raised his hand, asking everyone to remain calm, but the damage had already been done. The truth was finally surfacing, not because I had accused my son, because his own plan was collapsing under the weight of simple questions. I reached into my coat pocket and removed the memorial invitation. Then I held it up for everyone to see. My son asked all of you to come here today, to honor my memory. I looked around the sanctuary. So let me tell you something you deserve to know. I never asked for privacy. I never said goodbye. I never died. A painful silence settled over every pew. My son took my phone. He told people not to visit. He isolated me while I was recovering. And while you believed I was gone, I looked directly at Ryan. He was preparing to sell the only home his father and I spent nearly 40 years building together. Ryan finally broke. Tears streamed down his face. Whether they came from guilt or because his plan had failed, I honestly couldn't tell. Mom, I'm sorry. I made a terrible mistake. I shook my head slowly. No, Ryan. A mistake is forgetting someone's birthday. A mistake is taking the wrong exit. What you did? I paused, my voice trembling for the first time. Required hundreds of choices. You chose every single one of them. No one in the church said a word, because everyone understood. This wasn't one bad decision. It was a betrayal built one lie at a time. And there was no prayer, no excuse, no performance that could bury the truth anymore. No one left the church. Even after the memorial had effectively ended, people remained frozen where they stood. Some stared at me. Others stared at Ryan. No one seemed to know what to say. The silence was finally broken by Pastor Williams. I think he took a slow breath. Everyone needs to remain calm. His voice was steady, but I could hear the hurt behind. He looked directly at Ryan. Is there anything your mother has said that isn't true? Ryan opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The answer itself became an answer. Daniel Harper slowly closed his folder and stepped toward the pastor. I'm sorry, he said quietly, but I think this has gone beyond a family misunderstanding. Pastor Williams nodded. I agree. He turned to me. Margaret, would you like us to contact the authorities? For a moment, I looked at my son. He wasn't looking at me anymore. His eyes remained fixed on the floor. The confident man who had delivered that beautiful speech only minutes earlier was gone. Standing before me now was someone who finally understood that lies don't collapse all at once. They collapse one truth at a time. Yes, I answered. I think it's time. No one argued. No one tried to stop me. Nearly 30 minutes later, 2 uniformed police officers arrived at the church. They didn't rush inside. They didn't handcuff anyone. Instead, they calmly separated everyone involved and began asking questions. One officer sat with me in a quiet Sunday school classroom near the back of the church. His notebook remained closed for several minutes. He simply listened,
I told him everything. The pneumonia. The memorial invitation, the planned sale of my house. When I finished, he asked only one question. Mrs. Ellis, did you authorize your son to act on your behalf in any legal or financial matter? No. Did you sign a power of attorney? Never. He wrote something in his notebook. Then he thanked me. Across the hallway, another officer was speaking with Daniel Harper. Daniel handed over the folder he had brought to church. Inside were emails, text messages, draft listing documents, appointment confirmations. Everything Ryan had sent during the previous 2 weeks. One message immediately caught the officer's attention. It had been sent just 3 days earlier. Ryan had written, "Everything should be finalized after the memorial. I'll have all the paperwork ready." The officer looked up. Paperwork? Daniel nodded. That's what he called it. I assumed probate documents, but he never provided any. The investigation widened quickly. By early evening, officers accompanied me and Emily back to my house. The moment I stepped through the front door, my heart broke. The living room looked almost untouched, but something felt different. The walls were missing photographs. Several picture frames had been removed. The china cabinet stood open. Family albums were stacked neatly inside cardboard boxes. Small sticky notes had been attached to furniture. One read, "Keep." Another read, "Sell." Emily looked around in disbelief. He was already sorting everything. I walked slowly into my bedroom. My dresser drawers had been open. My personal files were missing. The small, fireproof lockbox David and I had kept for important documents was gone. My wedding album had been left on the bed, almost like someone had decided it wasn't worth taking. One of the officers called from the study. "Mrs. Ellis, you should probably see this." On my desk sat a portable scanner. Beside it, a stack of copied documents. Birth certificates, tax records, property records, insurance policies. Every file that contained my personal information had been scanned. The officer carefully picked up a sheet of paper using gloves. This wasn't random. It looks organized. Another officer entered carrying the missing lockbox. We found this in the garage. It had been forced open. My stomach tightened. Inside, the original deed to my house was still there. So were David's military records, our wills, our marriage certificate. Nothing had been stolen. Not yet. Because Ryan still needed one thing: legal authority. Without it, everything else was useless. The lead investigator carefully examined the documents spread across my dining room table. Then he looked at me. "Mrs. Ellis, I think your son believed that once everyone accepted your death, he'd have enough time to create the appearance that he had authority to sell the property." He paused before adding, "Fortunately, he never reached that point." I nodded quietly, because I walked into my own memorial.
The officer gave a small smile. I've investigated fraud cases for nearly 18 years. I've never said this before, but I think that may have been the only thing that stopped this one. As the forensic team continued photographing the house, another officer entered carrying a sealed evidence bag. Inside was my cell phone. It had been hidden inside the bottom drawer of Ryan's old bedroom. The battery was fully charged. It had never been broken. Just like I'd suspected. The investigator turned the phone over in his hands. Then he looked at me. "Mrs. Ellis, I have a feeling this phone is going to answer a lot of questions." I looked around the home David and I had built together. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't wondering whether I would lose my house. I was wondering something far more painful. At what point had my son stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as an obstacle? The investigation lasted nearly 3 months. Not because the truth was difficult to find, because there was so much of it. Every email Ryan had sent, every phone call he had made, every document he had copied, every lie he had told, left behind another piece of evidence. The detectives discovered that he had contacted 3 different real estate agents before choosing Daniel Harper. He had asked how quickly an inherited home could be sold. He had inquired about cash buyers. He had even requested estimates for clearing out the house before it went on the market. Each conversation had been based on the same lie. My mother recently passed away. The deeper investigators looked, the more disturbing the picture became. Ryan had redirected my mail without my permission. He had called utility companies pretending to be handling my estate. He had attempted to obtain information from my bank by claiming I was deceased and that he was managing my affairs. Fortunately, every institution had asked for legal documentation he couldn't provide. Again and again, his plan stopped just short of becoming irreversible. Not because he changed his mind, because the law required proof he didn't have. One afternoon, Detective Collins called me. "We've completed our investigation." His voice was professional, careful. "The district attorney has decided to move forward." I closed my eyes. For reasons I still don't fully understand, I wasn't relieved. I was tired. No mother dreams of sitting in her living room waiting to hear that her child is about to face criminal charges. No little boy grows up imagining he'll someday be investigated for trying to steal from the woman who gave him life. Somewhere along the way, we had both lost something. Several weeks later, I saw Ryan for the first time since the memorial. Not in my home. Not at church. In a courtroom. He looked smaller. The expensive suits were gone. So was the confidence. He barely looked up when I entered. His attorney spoke about financial pressure, poor decisions, desperation, stress. I listened quietly. None of those words explained what had happened. People under pressure ask for help. They don't bury their mothers while they're still breathing. When the judge asked if I wished to make a statement, I slowly stood. The courtroom became silent. I looked at Ryan for a long time. Then I spoke. "I have already forgiven my son." Several people looked surprised. Even Ryan lifted his head. I continued. But forgiveness? I paused. Is not the same as freedom from consequences. I forgive him because I refuse to spend the rest of my life carrying hatred. But I also believe every choice we make has a price. He didn't make one terrible decision. He made hundreds. Each lie required another. Each betrayal required a new one to protect it. I pray he becomes the man I once believed he already was. When I sat down, Ryan quietly began to cry. Whether he was mourning me or mourning the life he had destroyed, I honestly didn't know. The court imposed financial fraud-related penalties based on the evidence, along with other consequences tied to his deception and attempted misuse of my identity. It wasn't the sentence people whispered about afterward. It was the reason behind it. The judge said something I'll never forget. This case is not about property. It is about trust. And few things are more destructive than exploiting the trust of someone who loved you without conditions. Life slowly found its way back to normal. Or, at least, a new version of normal. The first thing I did was change every lock on the house. Not because I was afraid Ryan would come back. Because some doors, once broken, deserve to remain closed. I restored every family photograph to its place. David's military flag returned to the living room. Our wedding picture went back above the fireplace. For days, I unpacked boxes Ryan had already labeled for strangers. Every item I touched reminded me of the life we had built, not the one someone else had tried to sell. A month later, I met with an estate attorney. This time, everything was done properly, legally, carefully. I rewrote my will. People assumed I would remove Ryan from it out of anger. They were wrong. Anger had nothing to do with it. Trust did. The house would never again become the reason someone looked at me and saw dollar signs instead of a mother. Instead, I established a charitable scholarship in David's name for students who wanted to become teachers but couldn't afford college. It felt right. Education had given me a career. Kindness had given me purpose. Now, almost a year after the memorial, I returned to the church. The lilies were gone. The chairs had been rearranged. The sanctuary looked exactly as it always had. Pastor Williams walked over with a gentle smile. I still think about that day, he admitted. So do I. He hesitated. Does it ever stop hurting? I looked toward the front of the sanctuary, toward the place where my photograph had once stood surrounded by flowers. Then I smiled. It stops defining you. That's enough. Hundreds of people pretending to honor my life while preparing to sell the home his father and I spent decades building. He thought he had buried my voice before I ever took my last breath. He was wrong. The truth has a remarkable way of walking through the front door, even when everyone is convinced it belongs in the cemetery. And if there's one lesson I hope people remember from my story, it's this. Never mistake someone's kindness for weakness. And never assume the living have already surrendered, just because you've written their ending for them.